Welcome to the next conversation on the topic of solidarity with integrality. And we were talking about social innovation in the previous episode. I have Professor Ronnie Lessem here. I know he doesn't like me calling him a professor, but he is a professor. So today we are going to continue the conversation from our previous discussion about, he's presenting the idea of social innovation, and he spent about 50 years on pursuing this same vision that rather than just technological or financial and economic innovations, social innovation is the key to transform individuals, communities, societies, and regenerate a whole society. And what do we mean by regeneration? And what is the institution or a vehicle for that kind of regeneration? So I would welcome Ronnie. I would ask you to briefly just touch upon what exactly do we mean about social regeneration, and then we'll talk about what kind of vehicle or instrument or tools or institution do we need for that kind of regeneration, and why do we need that?
Anika, and let's begin the conversation with social innovation and the Communiversity. So the starting point is, if you like, what we see in the world as two major anomalies, sources of confusion. The one is, if we talk of technological innovation, everybody knows that there are hundreds of thousands of people around the world, be they working for Microsoft, Apple, or whatever, who are engaged in technological innovation. And then you look across to social innovation and you see, well, there's absolutely nothing like it. There are a few good souls here and there, but no such overall force or momentum on the one hand. On the other hand, we look at the world and we see what's happening in Russia, in Iran, many other such dramatic cases. And we say, what is the issue? What is the problem? Who's dealing with this? More and more military weapons, more and more technology solve the issues? Absolutely not. So where is the kind of social innovation which would, if you like, stop the war in Russia in its tracks, or stop it from happening in the first place? Where can we see it? How can we see it? It doesn't lie in the political realm in itself. It doesn't lie in the economic realm. Sure, civil society has a role, but that's very disparate and very widespread. Who should be taking the lead? And because we have been involved, as Anika said, for 5 decades with the university world, it sort of came to me that absolutely universities should take the lead. But the problem is they're a million miles away from it. Why are they a million miles away from it? For 2 or 3 reasons. One is the whole university model is modeled on, if you like, the Northwest, Europe and America. Sure, historically, universities came from the Middle East and so on, but in recent modern times, it's basically the American or the European model. So for one thing, they are actually modeled on a tiny proportion of the world which doesn't experience the very issues which raise the need for social innovation. The other major issues, they're becoming more commercialized, bums on seats, to use a horrible term. And the very reason of a university at its best, which we would argue is to be a beacon of light, a research academy, even in the elite university terms, is just a million miles away from somebody sitting in Bahrain or Zimbabwe or some country like that, where it's a question of churning out degrees for good or for ill. So the plus is that the university should be that beacon of light. The minus is the way it's constituted is a million miles away from what it should be. And just to complete that beginning of the story, the big difference between technological and social innovation, we'll come to that more, is if you're a technological innovator, nobody can imagine that you are such without having a background in biochemistry, in electronics, in physics, in biology or whatever. But if you're a social innovator, people love that term, you just kind of pluck it from somewhere because there's a social need, and off you go. You don't need to be a psychologist. You don't need to be a sociologist. You don't need to be an economist or any of those things. You just need to be somebody with lots of goodwill, and off you go. Well, what nonsense is that, right? So this is, if you like, the opening line.
Right. And then you propose, I do understand, and I agree with you, especially having spoken recently to two people from the financial world. What he was saying was that, all the principles of finance that he learned in a university, they don't apply there. In practice, there's no such thing. And the same with economics as well, and other things. So then you propose that, okay, if it's not, I know that you're taking forward the idea of the university as proposed by John Henry Newman. So you're furthering, you along with your colleagues, Ansam Adodo and Tony Bradley, have written a book, The Idea of the Communiversity. So the difference between a university or a communiversity, as we are proposing, is firstly, it should start with genealogically sort of embedding itself in a society or a community. So could you please explain what is that genealogy in your terms?
So for the genealogy, we've, if you like, coined a recent phrase. The original idea of the gene was grounding, emerging, navigating, and effecting, which is that you ground in local soils, you then emerge through an interaction between the local and the global. You then navigate by, in a sense, further evolving that interaction between the local and the global, and you then make it happen. Now, in recent times, we've codified that a little bit more by saying, firstly, you feel local. It's the exact opposite of the global local model. The conventional university is a global local model. You take a global idea of a university, like Newman's idea, and you apply it all over the world. The same for business schools. Business schools, in fact, are much worse, right? They're an extreme version of global local. So we say the opposite. You start by feeling local, right? So you feel yourself in Lahore in Pakistan, right? And you build from there. Now, in order to feel local, you need to identify with nature and community, right? So the starting point of the Communiversity is not the individual doing a course or degree, but it's the community learning. Because you feel for your local community, you co-engage with them and you begin to learn together. That's the first step. The next step is what we call intuit locally, globally. It's a good thing to feel local, to identify with your community, but the kind of issues we face around the world are way beyond any one particular community. So the next step is that you need to intuit local global. Now, the vehicle for intuiting local global is to engage in a transformation journey. Because in order to transform yourself, your community, and your society, you not only need to reach into your own world, your own calling, but you need to reach into what the world as a whole is calling for, right? Because we live in that kind of global village. So the next step is to move locally, globally, yourself as a Pakistani and the world as a whole. And the world, of course, as a whole has many different worlds within it. So it's a long-standing journey. That kind of transformation journey is what we replace education with. So instead of getting an education course, degree, program, training, you individually engage in a transformation journey, but because the starting point is feeling local, you bring your community with you and other communities as well. So those
Sorry,
two.
can I come in here? Because just to give a practical maybe example of genealogy, is that, say, for example, I was speaking to our colleague Alejandro, and he was telling us about Mondragon. And I did say to him that the idea of a cooperative or cooperativism worked in Spain or Basque region at that time. It didn't spread to all over the world, say, for example. And genealogically, if you've given me the example of I'm a Pakistani in Lahore, So in Lahore, maybe the idea of cooperatives wouldn't work. So what would work there is what is the reality on the local ground, which is more about brotherhood and fraternity, or, people kind of, and it's more about giving, benevolence. People just give charity too much. So I think that is one practical maybe example, as in, the genealogy or genealogically, the spirit or the soul force of society, we have to work with that. This is what you're proposing, right? And for that, we start from a learning community or a community.
So if you take the Mondragon example, which is fairly well known around the world, is probably the iconic cooperative of our time. As Anika said, it emerged out of a particular community in two respects. The one is the Basque community, the Basque world, which incidentally had a strong cooperative tradition. That's what you're talking about. So it was fertile ground to build Mondragon. The second thing, that the leading light Arizmendi worked with a micro community of people, right? 5 or 7 people around him. They formed a learning community. They worked with the wider learning community, which is the Basque country. And that is how that impulse was forged. And secondly, what Anika is leading to is that Arizmendi himself engaged in the transformation journey. He was a Catholic priest, and in the early days, he was very much influenced by Catholic social teaching. But in his later days, he was less and less influenced by Catholic social teaching and more influenced by Marxism and socialism, right? So in a sense, he fused together his religious Catholic side with his Catholic social, with his secular social side, which was part and parcel of his transformation journey, which then got imbued into the cooperative, which had both of those impulses. It had the Catholic social teaching on the one hand, and it had the secular socialist Marxist teaching on the other. So that was the transformation journey, which followed from the original learning community. The one other element you're mentioning, Anika, which is a bit of a fault line, is that in our language, Mondragon itself has become what we call a socioeconomic laboratory, right? So the laboratory element, which we haven't touched on yet, is added to the community element and the journey element, and there's one more step to go that we'll actually come to. However, one more thing we would say, which we see with Mondragon in the same way as we see with Sechem in Egypt, which we're very involved in, is that all too often the universities which are created by these laboratories, Mondragon in the Spanish case, in the Egyptian case, Sechem, become by and large conventional type of universities. So they don't work in Communiversity guise as one constituent of an overall Communiversity. They become a kind of university in their own right, and that's unfinished business we're working with.
Right. So previously in the last episode, I did pose this question. So whose role is it to work on these, pick up these threads and work on these impulses? And you and I have been working on this. I work especially in the Islamic and Pakistani context, say, for example, because that was my context. And in that context, I see that there was from the South Asian region, Shah Waliullah was the person who actually wrote about, bringing the Islamic and the economic together, which I think hasn't been worked out. Nobody has picked that thread. And I think this is what we are sort of implying here, that a communiversity kind of vehicle, which can work in a community with an organization, the socioeconomic laboratory, and also a university. So is that what you are sort of implying here? Am I translating it correctly for people to understand? Because I often get that this is very complex, the language is very esoteric. So that's why I'm kind of breaking it.
So it's kind of like it, but I would like to add a couple of things. One is when we say university, there's no way in which a university as a whole can evolve into a communiversity. It's much too bureaucratic, a structure to actually transform itself in that light. What we're talking about is a particular edge of a university, a transformative edge of a university, actually co-engaging. So if we take the second case, we work continually with Sechem itself in Egypt, and with certain little pockets or elements of the Heliopolis University for Sustainable Development who want to join hands with us. So that's the first thing. We're not talking of a university as a whole. We're talking of a transformative edge of it. Secondly, what we're saying is, if you like, the catalytic element, the fourth element, we've mentioned the laboratory, the journey, and the community, is the research academy. The quintessential role that edge of the university should play is to become the research academy. Now, that is much easier said than done, because there are lots of research academies around the world. However, the research academy we are talking about is one that builds on local soils explicitly. And whereas in the humanities, if we're talking of fine art or music, or even perhaps religion, we could say that's a matter of course. When we come to the world of economics and enterprise and business that we're dealing with, it virtually never is the case, unless you happen to be in America. If you happen to be in America, it will be the case. If you happen not to be in America, even in Europe, by and large, the business schools are not actually, or schools of economics even, are not actually rooted in local soils. That is what we're talking about by that edge of the university, which co-engages with the laboratory, the community, and the journey. And then one final thing back to what you were talking about, Anika, in relation to Islamic economics. So you will have the giants like Umar Shapra or Chaudhry, who as individual public intellectuals, or Sada, will talk about Islamic economics. But nobody is institutionalizing it. Which is the issue we're facing and which the university needs to address.
Right. So there are four components of a communiversity as proposed by you, Tony Bradley, and Anselm Adodo. And it starts from a learning community. And then that community or individual takes a transformation journey towards, so learning on the journey. I'm just reading from your book here. So learning on the journey, what does that mean? I mean, I know that you often tell all of us that learning is a lifelong process, and it's a journey that we all take forever. It never stops. But so in a communiversity environment, when we say a learning community, what does that mean to an ordinary person? How would they understand? Thank you.
So there are actual, I have to say, rare concepts, processes, which deal specifically with learning communities. And unfortunately, most of them come out of the West, which is ironic because you say the communal societies are in the South or perhaps in the East, but they don't conceptualize that process of learning communities. The closest we've got is participatory action research. Now, participatory action research is a form of research. So you might say, is that learning? Is that not learning? We would argue that research and learning in that case very much overlap. So PAR, participatory action research, is a form of building learning communities historically, culturally, from the ground up, from the roots up, which is well known around the world, and which actually did originate from Africa, originally from President Nyerere in Tanzania, and got kind of exported from there. So as a concept, as a technique, to answer your question, Anika, we would refer to participatory action research as such a concept or technique. On the other hand, if you start practically, put the technique on one side, for example, what our colleagues in Zimbabwe are doing, particularly the case of Dad Shumba Taraniko, who happens to come from my home village where I was born, a place called Beira. He's been working as part of his PhD and beyond over the last 5 to 7 years to enable his local community to continually learn and evolve. And when you're dealing with a local community in Africa, it's not a question just of formal learning processes. The question of learning community also rubs shoulders with the question of laboratory. What is the laboratory which actually promotes the learning community? The laboratory in his case is what he calls Vakamusha. That's his company, Vakamusha, which is spending the time, the money, the energy, the insight into building up his local community, and the laboratory and the community are actually working together to co-evolve over time to become self-sufficient. So communal learning is taken out of the rather kind of isolated, insular language of processes of learning, and very much rub shoulders with processes of development in this case.
Right, but if we take Tao Chumba's example, especially here, then it didn't start with the learning community. It started from his own PhD journey, which could be, we can say it was his transformation journey. So it didn't start from the community itself. It started from the individual being on the transformation journey, and with his socioeconomic laboratory already in place because he was a businessman. So then he turns back to his community now that he's setting up, he's practically working on his thesis. So do you think
Well, I think what you're saying, Anika, is very interesting and very insightful, because the answer, of course, has to be both and. It started with himself on his PhD journey, but in the process of his journey, right from the beginning, he kind of awoke to his role as a key member of his community, right? And we've got many other examples of that. As they start their own journey, it kind of shines a light on their own community, and they realize the one cannot be separated from the other. So yes, it's himself, but he himself is nothing without his community. And that transformation journey heightens that connection. That's the one thing. The second overlap where it's both and is, yes, he's a businessman, but when he started on his journey, he wasn't a businessman who saw himself as a socioeconomic laboratory. It's only once he engaged on that journey, he began to see, aha, I'm a socioeconomic laboratory. Incidentally, the thing that's left out of account, which is still the case, is the research academy. We'll come to that. But those two practical fields of the learning community in the socioeconomic laboratory, and if you like, the transformation journey in between, they fitted overlap rather well together.
So it basically starts with the individual rather than the community, because I'm saying this because it's often quite difficult to activate or mobilize the community unless you are in that place. You have been on that transformation journey yourself. And we have these prime examples like Tao Chumbas of the world, or maybe Amjad Saqib, because it kind of starts from the individual, or what I say, it's the transmutation. Something transmutates and then they kind of revert back to the community they're part of, and maybe then mobilize the community, because it never starts from a community level itself. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a discussion I've often had with my ex-partner, Alexander Schiefer, work we wrote together, where we would argue he starts from the individual, I start from the community. And we'd have many discussions that way. And of course, it's ambiguous. It's both and. The other element of the community, if I take another example from Zimbabwe, a more dramatic one, which involved 300,000 people in the end, although it started with an individual's transformation journey, is that individual, his name was Muchineripi, the son of the chief, actually could have got nowhere without a woman in the community who happened to be the chief catalyst. And in a sense, that whole project would never have got off the ground, although he was on the PhD program, without her, in a sense, as a vital catalytic force. So, is it him? Is it the community? But I think we can kind of settle at both and. What I think is of real interest to us, and hopefully to anybody listening and watching, is that what we're talking about is much, much easier said than done. Because these different elements, the four elements, and we still have to come more to the most problematic, the research academy, don't conventionally work together. That once somebody is engaged on their journey, as you put it, let's take your argument, Anika, of their personal transformation journey, yes, and their marriage to the community, but on the other hand, the whole development of the socioeconomic laboratory might, in a sense, begin to waver. And as far as the Search Academy is concerned, it completely slips into the background because there's no university in sight which takes any interest in such matters. And our practical community development people and business people don't have the time or space to engage with such. So we don't want to kind of lessen the awareness that these are difficult matters, which comes back to your opening question, Anika, that unless some catalytic force, hopefully in our case, TCA, Transformed Communiversity Associates, becomes alive and well, these things as a whole just don't happen on their own.
So I was also hinting at the innovation ecosystem that you propose, which starts from a catalyst, and the catalyst then needs a steward and facilitators and researchers. So can you just maybe tell us about that? How did you come up with this ecosystem?
What Nika has just said is profoundly important, and in a sense is the big switch that's needed as we move from, if you like, the university program of publishing papers and doing degrees into the Communiversity, because unless you have what we call that innovation ecosystem, which incidentally actually came up fairly early in our work, and our first exploration of the integral world, Southeast, North, and West, and we began to ask ourselves, who and what personally embodies those four different worlds in a kind of educational developmental arena? Because as we saw it, if you like, your conventional student professor is very much that kind of northern world, right? But what is the impulse from the south? And we said stewardship, that communal stewardship coming from the south. What is that connected east? That's the catalytic role, which makes all the connections, both in theory and practice. And if you like, the doing angle, which is the facilitator or the developer. So we need the facilitator, the developer. Yes, we need the research and the educators. Yes, we need the catalyst. Yes, we need the stewards. And in a conventional educational setting, half of those roles are completely missing. It's all about research and education. And occasionally, particularly if you come from a business angle, you're saying, who's doing the doing? Or are we connecting the doing, the facilitating with the actual educating? But as for overall stewardship within the community or catalyzation, which is the most vital role of all, it's patently missing. So as Anika said, unless those roles are actually built into the fabric of the Communiversity just won't shine.
Thank you for this. And I think in the next conversation, we can then expand on this because then you also designed a whole PhD program around it. And that PhD is not of an individual's PhD, it's of the whole community with all these catalytic roles and stewardship and, the researchers and facilitators. So one person is not doing a PhD, as you've been stressing too much upon this for forever. It's basically a PhD which should be accredited by a university, their community that they're working with. And that is what should be, that is what is missing in the university world, as you are hinting at. It could be, the academia, they produce a lot of research, they write a lot of papers, but this kind of holistic approach is missing. So maybe we can then talk about that in the next episode. Thank you so much. This was very interesting.